Experiment. Thank you. So jazz music. So Paul and I have known each other. We're fellow tech geeks here in Detroit, but we've never played together. And we did that on purpose because that's what jazz is all about. It's about improvising. It's about making things up as you go. And in today's complex world, whether it's in healthcare or business, it's pretty much the same thing, isn't it? We're faced with challenging obstacles. We have to innovate in real time, and the world has become too complex and too fast for us to simply follow an operating manual and expect to win. The interesting thing about musicians, and specifically jazz musicians, is that the culture of a group is designed for it. And as a result, jazz musicians thrive. In fact, what we were just playing now, I just called out something, all I said is F blues, which is a very simple chord structure. And we just made up what we played, no notes. The reason that I'll argue that jazz musicians are able to do that has nothing to do with people being super creative, because the research shows we're all creative. In fact, Harvard University ran a study, and they asked the age-old question, is creativity born or developed? Turns out that creativity, in fact, is 85% learned behavior, which means that all of us, even us on bad days, have enormous creative capacity. I'll argue that the reason jazz musicians can improvise is because the confines of the social structure around being in a jazz group support it. So if you're going to play jazz in a club and you just play it safe, or you play only the notes on the page, people will laugh you out of the room. On the other hand, if you take risks and make mistakes and stumble, that's what's celebrated, and that's where the magic happens. I'll argue it's the exact same thing in today's complex business world. Because if we sit at our desks, play it safe, and do everything we can not to get fired, it's the beginning of the end. Because the world is too complex and moving too quickly to deal with that. So the lesson that we can all learn, I believe, from musicians is building a culture that supports risk-taking and doesn't penalize new ideas, it celebrates them. In your organization, let's say a team member comes up to you and says, hey, I've got an idea. Let's just say it's a terrible idea. What do you normally do? Send them back to their cube. Hey, that's a terrible idea. Go shut up. The problem is when you do that, you've trained that person never to come forward with another idea again. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should pander to them or lie or say it was a good idea if it was a bad idea. But what you could do instead is just remove judgment altogether, just like jazz musicians do. So you might say something like, tell me more about that idea. What was the thinking that led you to that conclusion? Where else do you see this idea going? Let's say they go back to their desk now, and they feel heard and empowered. Maybe they come back with 9 more terrible ideas in a row. So what? Because that 10th idea, that gem, could be transformational. And it's that very idea that would have never come out had we been so sharp to penalize their thinking. There's an old saying, funny enough, in jazz music, if you play the wrong note, don't worry about it, just play it 3 more times and people will think it was on purpose. But it's a fairly healthy approach for we business folk as well, because we should be encouraging each other to go out on a limb and take risks, because if not, we run the risk of some much more serious things, like mediocrity and irrelevance and getting passed by the competition. Paul, I was curious, why do you think so many musicians, because we've talked about this before, we're both in the tech world and we deal with technology people all day long. Why do you think so many musicians do so well in that type of environment?
I fell backwards into technology because I was a musician rather than the reverse, and I just found myself in front of a keyboard one day, a computer keyboard, and it's the same thought process in my mind for working with music as it is working with code. So I found that to be a very easy transition, and one thing we've been talking about is educating kids today, right? And I contend that if you can teach a 3-year-old to play violin, you can teach a 3-year-old to code, and that's what we're going to try to do around here in Detroit. It's the same thought process.
One of the things that I've thought about quite a bit is that in these challenging times that we live in, we can no longer rely on the models of the past and expect to win. Over the last 5 years, the world has changed so dramatically. And in fact, today, we're living at a pace of change like none other in history. And what's happened is that many of the advantages that we faced have become commoditized. You look at the challenges we suffer here in Detroit, and many of them were because we just kept doing the same old, same old. We kept doing things the same way, and we failed to look forward. Today, what's happened is that creativity has emerged as the single most important leadership attribute and our single most important key to success in these challenging times. If you think about it, it's the one thing that can't be outsourced. It's our one source of sustainable competitive advantage. So I believe as leaders, it's our responsibility, because in the past maybe it was a nice to have, today it's mission critical to nurture the creativity of our teams, to help them think like musicians. So speaking of music, let's just play. Let's just see what happens. Ready? Go. Wow. So that sounded horrible, didn't it? Didn't that sound horrible? It sucked. Let's talk about why it sucked. It stunk because we didn't coordinate our efforts at all. We were not aligned. And even in the world of jazz, which is so open and so free for creativity, it still requires people being on the same page, such as what's the key signature or what are the chord changes. So let's try that again. We'll do a brief one. And now let's do the song Summertime. You know that one? Let's do Summertime in A minor and see if it sounds any better. Let's give it a shot. Ready? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So it sounded better, right? And the reason it did is because we were on the same page. So when you are dealing with your own teams, again, it could be in healthcare or music, and you say things like, okay, here's our 19 priorities. We care about people. People are number one. Next slide of the PowerPoint deck. We care about innovation. Next slide. We care about efficiency. Next slide. We care about cost cutting. Next slide. We care about HR policies. We care about regulation. If you try to do everything all at once, it sounds like that first song that we played. But when you become aligned, whether it's in music or business, that's when the magic happens. That's when you're truly able to innovate. A couple other thoughts. One of the main themes of this conference is failure. We've all heard of WD-40, right? The lubricant for getting rid of squeaks. I don't know if you know this, but it stands for Water Displacement 40th Experiment. Could have easily been WD-31. But what happened is that they kept at it. They kept tinkering and innovating. And ultimately, they reached a great solution. There's a myth that many of us embrace, unfortunately, and we think that creative breakthroughs come from a lightning bolt from the sky, and all of a sudden we're magically empowered. Oh my God, I got the best idea. It's fully defensible, ready for prime time. Rarely happens. Much more often, including Thomas Edison, including Henry Ford, innovation comes as a series of experiments, most of which fail. And you learn and don't judge, just get the data and go on to the next one, and ultimately those lead to the breakthroughs that we seek. There's an old saying that every bullseye is the result of 100 misses. Why don't we teach our kids that? Why don't we teach each other that? So I had the privilege of writing a book on the topic of creativity and innovation. I wanted to share a couple quick things from my research. I interviewed all these companies and leaders to boil down the creative process into a step-by-step approach. Anyway, one company that I interviewed they have a Failure of the Year award. So this big banquet ceremony, and they celebrate the team member of the year and the project of the year, but they also celebrate the failure of the year. This is for the team or individual that had a great idea. All their numbers made sense. They went for it. Didn't work out at all. But good for them. So instead of punishing failure, they celebrated it. Think about the message that drives deep into the DNA of this company about taking responsible risks and being creative. Another company that I interviewed issues every team member 2 corporate get-out-of-jail-free cards each year. They hand them out and they say, listen, go out on a limb, be creative, and if you really screw something up, hand us one of these cards, you're off the hook, no questions asked. On the annual reviews, a team leader will be disappointed with the team member if they haven't used both of them. So you say, is that risky? Well, perhaps, but I'll challenge you for a minute. What's the risk of not doing something like that? So many people, so many organizations live their lives trying to play it safe, only to discover that playing it safe has become the riskiest move of all. Polaroid tried to play it safe. They had this product, it was the killer product, instant film, 50-year run, #1 in the category. But when people at the company started saying, hey, maybe we should adapt, maybe we should change, maybe we should evolve, maybe we should take some risks, management, not leadership, management, said, well, we can't cannibalize our core business. Have you ever heard that term, cannibalize your business? No offense to anybody, but that's a stupid term. It's stupid because it implies that we have the ability to prevent cannibalization altogether, as if Polaroid was all-encompassing and they controlled the world. Well, of course, we live in a free market society. And the point is, since they chose not to cannibalize their core business, somebody else did. Today, it's our responsibility as leaders, as parts of our community, to always be cannibalizing. I've always had a saying that in our company, some company, 6 months from now, a new company will come along and put us out of business. So it might as well be us. And I do the same thing personally. I say to myself, how can I put the Josh of 6 months ago out of business? We live in a world that's so competitive and so challenging. If we're not the source of reinvention, somebody else is going to come along and hand it to us. You know, I was thinking, I'm sure most of us voted this week. Let's think about the electoral college system for a minute. Does that make sense to anybody in this room? Show of hands? Okay, you understand it probably because you learned it in history class or whatever, but it was probably a great system when it was put in place. I mean, think about what our founding fathers were dealing with. They had to make sure that fraud was prevented. They had to make sure that people had access to information, which they did not at that time. They had to make sure that the small states got an equal or somewhat of a voice, at least compared to the big states. So it was probably a great idea back in the day. But a lot can happen in 236 years, can it? So today, we don't face those problems at all. Today, no one's going to argue there's not enough information. Information is ubiquitous. No one's going to argue that we can't conduct a fair election. Well, I suppose you could argue that in Florida in 2000. But we certainly have the technology such that every vote could count. And what happens in our current situation is that the little states don't get ignored, like 43 states get ignored, because 7 states that are swing states encompass all the politicians' attention. It's just an out-of-date system. And no disrespect to our founding fathers, I'm happy to be an American and all that, but we need to adapt that system. And if you really study it, it's an absolute no-brainer. Make it a popular vote, end of story, everyone has a voice. But the problem is we're so mired in tradition that it's very difficult for us to get out of our own way. We may not be able to force a change that takes an act of Congress, but all of us in our own lives can force changes to drive our own organizations forward. Here at Henry Ford Health System, which is an incredible health system, the work that's going on to drive change and innovation is helping to save lives and helping to build our community. I got to believe these days we don't use leeches, right, to kill illness anymore? Thank God. But all of us have that responsibility to attack the little and the big things in our companies to make sure that we're doing things that should be done today with the relevant information as opposed to simply saluting the flag of the past. Another thing I want to challenge you is that when you're faced with problems, which we all are, or you're stuck on something, which we also all are often, instead of throwing resources at it, which is our first instinct, or throwing money at it, try throwing your imagination at it. I'll give you a quick example. There's a guy named Doug Dietz, and Doug is the head of the MRI division for General Electric. Throughout his 25-year career, Doug has saved thousands of lives. But like you and I are often, Doug was stuck. The problem he was facing was that while these machines were terrific, they scared the heck out of kids. Turns out that 80% of small children needed to be sedated before going into these life-saving tests. So he tried all the obvious things that you and I would try. He tried making the opening bigger. He tried shortening the procedure time. But none of them yielded the important medical results that were required. So here's the cool thing, and here's what I would encourage you to do as well. Doug took a creative leap. He flipped the problem on its head. And instead of trying to change the machine, he said, I can't change the machine, so I'm going to change the experience. Doug launches Pirate Island. And what he did is he designed the rooms differently. They were painted as if the floors were the seas, and there was sailing ships and clouds up on the walls. And the device itself was painted to look like a pirate ship. So not only did the scenery change, they trained hospital workers differently. So when a kid went into this machine, it was no longer, hey, you're going in this big, scary machine, stand still or else. It was, you're going on a pirate adventure. And as you're sailing the 7 seas, make sure you stand really still so those pirates don't come by and tickle you. Sedation ended. Crying and screaming stopped. And Doug knew he had finally reached his goal when one day a 7-year-old girl, a cancer patient, tugged on her mom's shirt after the procedure and said, Mom, can we come again tomorrow? That is the power of taking a creative risk, taking a creative leap, and letting your imagination soar. So I thought we'd have a little bit of fun here today and let your imagination soar. So what we're going to do is we're going to have you compose a little bit of a jazz tune, and Paul and I are going to try to play on your composition. So, and by the way, I think it's a good simulation for what we're facing in our daily lives. You know, when a patient comes in here requiring life-saving treatment, we don't have time to consult here and there. We got to leap into action. And sometimes we're faced with ambiguity, and we have to innovate in real time, just like we do in music. So I'll start by asking for a letter from someone, letter between A and G. Okay, F, we'll start with F. And good, now should that be major or minor? F minor, all right, we're going with F minor. All right, so we'll take another letter. You had one over here, C. Okay, so that, you want to do, how about C7th, okay with you? Okay, C7. And let's do a third letter between A and G. D. D it is, okay. So we're going to go with D, and let's do D major. Does that sound okay to you? D major 7. So here's what we're going to do. We're making this up on the fly, so it may be a disaster. Let's see what happens. So we're going to go F minor for 4 measures, okay? We're going to go D major for 4 measures, and then we're going to go C7 for 4 measures, okay? And we're going to just riff on it a little bit. I'll play a solo on it, you play a solo. Let's just see what happens, okay? Now, by the way, isn't that typical for your day? Do you typically get beautiful results or instructions, totally detailed, know exactly what to do? Of course not. You get this, and you got to make something of it. So F minor, D major, and C7. You ready? We're going to do it, Paul? Ready? We got to do a little fist bump here. You ready to rock, man? All right, we're going to do it. All right, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. to F minor. Take it, Paul? F minor. C major. C7. F minor. Awesome, man. Paul, way to go. So we're a bunch of computer nerds that like to play jazz. But the principles apply. When you let your creativity shine, when you let your imagination soar, when you're willing to stick your finger in the eye of the complacent incumbents and take a risk and not be afraid to fail, that's where the magic happens. That's what allows us to reach our full potential, and that's what allows us to make history. Thanks so much.